Young Earth creationists spend a great deal of time arguing that dinosaurs and human beings once lived together. They must have, if God formed all living creatures in the first 6 days of creation as stated in the book of Genesis, and if the earth itself is only 6,000 years old.
Well, I can tell you when dinosaurs were created. They were created on day 6, because dinosaurs were land animals. Land animals were created on day 6, so dinosaurs were created on day 6. The Hebrew word tannin is translated in the Old Testament, in the King James Version, by the word dragon. Dragon. Now, isn't that interesting? We can go further. The Hebrew word seraph is usually translated in most places in the Old Testament as fiery flying serpent. Fiery flying serpent. There are legends about dragons and about fiery flying serpents from outside the Bible. I think that those legends are people having seen dinosaurs. The dragons of old legends are probably dinosaurs, and it's interesting that some scientific documents from before 1841 describing some of the fossils that had started to be found in Victorian times of these giant reptiles that they hadn't thought of a name for yet, they actually named them as dragons. And they used that word in the scientific literature prior to 1841. You can go into the British Library and look up the information, and it's there. Scientific documents using the word dragon. Of course, they won't like to admit that today, but it's there. You can dig it up, and it exists. Dragons are probably dinosaurs from history, and that indicates that people have seen them.
What does the Bible say about dinosaurs? Well, the Bible doesn't use the word dinosaur. That's a modern word that we've assigned to these creatures that we've discovered in the fossil record that are immense reptiles. And yet the Bible does speak about an immense reptile. The Hebrew word tannin is a word that is translated sea serpent or even dragon in some translations. And the whole idea in mythology of dragons and these giant, creatures that could spew fire, really there's a little bit more truth to that, because in every culture they speak of these things. There's pictures on walls, with people confronting these huge beasts. But even more so, you go to the Bible in Job chapter 40 and 41 and you find a couple of descriptions of some animals that God made. He's actually challenging Job. Have you seen Leviathan? Have you seen Behemoth? And these animals he's describing, he says, behold Behemoth, he moves his tail like a cedar tree. Now, some modern translators have made equivalent of Behemoth to the elephant or the hippopotamus. And I don't know if you've ever seen the tail of a hippopotamus or an elephant, but the idea of it looking like a cedar tree, it doesn't come to mind. So somehow this Behemoth creature had a tail like a cedar tree, a huge tree. That would only fit what we know as Brontosaurus or some of these gigantic, reptiles in the fossil record, which would imply that they were concurrent with Job. Job was the oldest book of the Bible. He actually encountered people that lived, that survived the flood. So it's very possible that these gigantic sea creatures and land animals that had grown huge before the flood, most of them died in the flood. Some that were perhaps even taken on the ark survived and grew up, but the climate change did not allow for them to become very prevalent, and eventually they died out because of climate changes. But at the end of the day, I have no problem with dinosaurs being around during the time of man, not as supposed millions and millions of years before man came into being, because the Bible speaks of it.
But for all the so-called scriptural evidence that these apologists bring to support their notion that dinosaurs and man lived together, why do they ignore the book of Leviticus? In Leviticus, the author goes into great detail about which animals are clean and acceptable for food, and which animals are not. The author lists the camel, hyrax, rabbit, pig, eagle, vulture, kite, raven, owl, gull, hawk, stork, bat, locust, katydid, cricket, grasshopper, weasel, rat, gecko, skink, and chameleon. Leviticus does mention those animals with cloven hoofs generally, but since dinosaurs didn't have hooves, clearly they could not be included here. Leviticus mentions things in water with fins and scales as being edible, but counts as an abomination those things that live in water without fins and scales. Aquatic dinosaurs didn't have fins or scales. Are they to be thought of as included in that which was counted as an abomination? Doesn't the book of Job, though, describe the Leviathan, a creature young earth creationists believe to be a marine dinosaur, as having scales? Does that mean Leviathan was edible? Leviticus does mention animals without hooves, but nonetheless had a divided foot. Would that include dinosaurs, as well as dogs and cats? Leviticus mentions those creatures which creep upon the earth, and lists among these lizards of varying sorts. Should this include dinosaurs? If dinosaurs and human beings once stomped around together in the ancient Near East, as apologists claim they did, why didn't the author of Leviticus tell his readers which dinosaurs, or dragons, or flying serpents, or sea serpents, or behemoths, or leviathans, were edible, and which were not? It seems odd that the author would mention something as specific as the lowly weasel, but fail to make note of the towering Tyrannosaurus rex. You'd think such enormous creatures, a single carcass of which could have fed an entire village for weeks, or even months, and which presumably tasted just like chicken, would get specific mention there.